right, if everybody's ready, we'll go ahead and get started. So I hope you will all help me welcome Dr. Thomas McDonald, our guest today. He's the author of Texas Rangers, Ranchers, and Realtors, James Hugh Callahan and the Day Family in the Guadalupe River Basin. So Tom McDonald is a retired R&D pharmaceutical executive, a world traveler, a seventh-generation Texan, and the author, as we said. So this narrative documents the real-life saga of ordinary Texans trying to survive on a diverse, complicated, and constantly evolving post-revolutionary Texas frontier. As an adolescent, Tom sat mesmerized by stories from his grandfather, stories of their family heritage. When his grandfather passed away in 1979, Tom began to collect information to confirm those legendary tales. Upon his retirement, he spent 11 years composing and chronicling the lives of his ancestors and their influence upon the space and events in Guadalupe River Basin in south central Texas. And Tom McDonald holds a Bachelor of Science as well as a Master of Science in Biology from Texas Christian University. He earned his PhD in cell biology from Tulane University and completed an International Senior Managers Program at Harvard Business School. So if y'all could give him a hand for me.
Thank you. Thanks, Myra, very much. Like you said, I am a seventh-generation Texan, and my roots go all the way back to this part of Texas. My grandfather would tell me stories when I was about 13 years old, and so and whenever we would get together, he and I would end up on the front porch, and he would tell these stories repeatedly. It was the same story over and over again. And he died in 1979, so I thought when I retired that I would try to write. I looked to see if what he told me was factual or not. And most of what he told me was factual. He did not know, he only knew maybe 5% of the whole story. I cannot touch on all the subjects in the book tonight, and my thrust is to give you an idea of what the book is about and to encourage you to read it. I do have an ulterior motive. I brought books to sell. I do sell them less than retail, and you can give me a check or cash, or I'll take an IOU. I'm sure you're trustworthy. But in biology, we talk about groups of organisms. Seguin is a unique example of where there were several groups of family that came together at the same time. And if you know much about the history of Seguin, there was the Sowell family, the Nichols family, the King family, the Turner family, the Smith family, and so forth and so on. And one of them was the family of Johnson and Sarah Day, Hemminger Day. But the personalities that my grandfather would tell me about was James Clinton Nell, Francis and Sarah Elizabeth Berry Johnson and Sarah Hemminger Day, and James Hughes Callahan and Sarah Medissa Day. These folks are discussed to some extent, but I've concentrated particularly on James Hughes Callahan and Sarah Medissa Day and the Johnson and Sarah Hemminger Day family. Those are the folks that settled here in Seguin. When the Day family crossed the Sabine River on Christmas Day in 1836 in San Augustine and decided to stay there and came down to Gonzales in the fall of 1837 and to Gonzales. And they stayed there, and Johnson Day was elected to Justice of Peace, and he died in July of 1838. He died of a dysentery epidemic that was going through the city of Gonzales. The Gonzales people were upset that so many people were there and that new people were there and that they were causing the dysentery, that it caused a group of people to decide that they would find their own town, and they did. They came and decided and settled here in Seguin. Sarah Hemminger Day was alive at that time, and she had one son and 6 daughters. As you can imagine, this attracted a lot of men to where she lived. And you can see who the folks are that her son and daughters married, and more or less when they were married. I'll let you notice that James Milford had 3 wives. Sarah Medissa had 2 husbands. Actually, Henry Basil King had a second wife. It was not uncommon for people to have multiple spouses at this time. Usually spouses lived the same length of life beginning in the 20th century. But before that, it was quite common that people would have multiple spouses, as you can see exampled here. And I will talk about some of these folks tonight, but they all settled here in Seguin and began their life in Texas here in Seguin. Now, I'm a scientist. Source documentation is important to scientists. And I was insistent that all of my statements in the book was backed up by source documentation. I discovered that some historians would fabricate information. And several of that is explained in the book if you will read it. But anyway, what were my sources? I sourced county clerk and district clerk minutes and records from Guadalupe, Gonzales, Comal, Caldwell, Blanco, Kendall counties, and several others around. I also sourced documentation from the Texas State Library and Archives, the Center for American History at the University of Texas, the National Archive, the U.S. Census, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, and local historical societies. All of these documents that I sourced, I kept copies of. I also visited, because some of the action takes place in Mexico, the Mexican archives in Nuevo Leon, Coahuila, the military archives in Mexico City, and the Musquis and the Guajardo papers located in Yale University. These are a rich source of information about events in Texas at the time we're talking about. Many historians have not sourced these documents. It is very difficult to get into the military archives at Mexico City, but I had a friend that actually took me there twice. I also collected family histories and photos. It was my intent that when you read the book, you're going to see thousands of names. That was my intent. This is also a reference book about the history of families in this area of Texas. And I wanted to know about how the Callahan and Day's family interacted with various people and why they were there and what their interactions were. I used Ancestry.com to try to find descendants of these people. Amazingly, I could find a couple hundred. More amazingly, 20 or 30 had records left or stories left by their ancestors, some which pertain to the events that I'm talking about here. I collected those. I also used books, magazines, journal articles, and newspapers. I want to particularly highlight the newspapers. These are all digitalized today. All of the old newspapers in Texas are digitalized at the Portal for Texas History. All the newspapers in Mexico, virtually everywhere in the world. Old newspapers are digitized and used searchable. They became an invaluable tool of providing a perspective on what people thought at that time in that particular location about events that were going on. I encountered several diaries. One is the prayer diary of Sarah Hembrier Day. The original is in a descendant of hers. She's related to me. She lives in Bulverde. I have encouraged her to put that diary in an archive. It will disappear at some point if she does not. She did give me a photocopy of it. And I kept that. I made a transcript of what Sarah Hembrier Day said in her diary. Now, Sarah Hembrier Day is my 4th great-grandmother. I also ran across a diary by Elisa Wupperman. She was a Tips, a German immigrant, and she married Otto Wupperman in 1850 in Seguin area. He had a store here. She wrote often in her diary about events in their life. They lived about halfway between here and New Braunfels. It's an exquisite account of events that take place in this area. The original diary is in the hand of one of her descendants in Hanover, Germany. He published her diary in German. One of her descendants translated the diary. One of her descendants was a librarian for the chemistry department at the University of Texas. She translated it. I traced down the descendant, and I got a copy of that diary and letters. It's an important perspective of what was taking place in this part of the world during the 1850s. There's a diary of Arminda Hankins Bellinger. Now, one of the daughters of Johnson and Sarah Hembrick Day married Eli Skaggs Hankins, and they lived in Prairie Lea. Their granddaughter was Arminda Hankins. She can remember, her grandmother lived until about 1910. She remembered her very well. She kept a diary and wrote about some of the stories that her grandmother told her. In Gonzales, a important family was the Bellinger family. He was I think the county judge. But in the Civil War, they went to Mexico. She kept a diary of their journey to Monterrey, Mexico. Her son drove cattle from Gonzales to Illinois in 1858 and kept a diary. I have copies of every one of those. I have left with Mara a flash drive. Every digital record I have on Gonzales and Guadalupe County is on that flash drive. It's donated to the library here. These diaries are also in that flash drive. So my intent is to populate libraries with this book, and also selected libraries with certain records that I kept. All of these records that I have, whether they're hard copies or digital copies, I have donated to the Daughters of the Republic of Texas Library in San Antonio. I have about 20 running feet of hard copies, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 digital images. Virtually every document I use is on that. There are 2 flash drives, and it's deposited with them. And I left it there for historians to use. If some person thinks that what I wrote is incorrect, then they can go back and look at the records that I have used. It was a difficult for me to find documentation from many historians. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but just to be perspective, where we are, the Guadalupe Reservation was occupied by the Lipans, the Toncoas, the Coahuilans, also the Carranca Indians. In 1851, a man passed through here, a Catholic priest of the Spanish government, right where we are. And the Humphreys and the Branch and the Sal Humphrey Branch and the Sal families of DeWitt Colony settled here and built houses in 1832. They abandoned it in 1836 because of the Revolutionary War. Humphreys and his wife took a ship back to England. The Sal family remained here, and they came back and settled here in 1838. When you probably know, but there were 33 original shareholders of the Seguin. It was a corporation, not a town as we know, not a government as we know it today. Sarah Hembrick Day was a shareholder. When they had town shareholder meetings, she attended it, and she voted, the only woman, voted with the men on the subjects. Now, I said that's a corporation, it wasn't a government, but I maintain she was the first woman in Texas that voted. She built her house on Walnut Springs Branch, and it became the old Ranger House. She also used it as a Methodist church. She was a Baptist. Her father was a New Light Baptist. In Comanche, Texas, where I grew up, we called them Hard Shell Baptists, but that's what her father was. And but it was a Ranger house where the Rangers would congregate when they went on patrols. It was a Methodist church on Sunday morning and a dance hall on Saturday night. And then a hospital when the Rangers were wounded. And all of this is described in the book. It was the last house on the prairie facing west in most of the 1840s The only thing between it and San Antonio was prairie grass and oak trees. This is the old Ranger house. You've probably seen this. Actually, it was a dog trot cabin, and and she lived with her son in the house. And when his first wife died, he remarried, and they moved to another house, and the family came and filled in the walls on the dog trot cabin, and they plastered the house inside and outside. And the old Ranger house I think it was torn down in 1965, was actually a plaster structure. It had walnut rafters, and it used cloth for the ceiling. A descendant has the mantle, and one of my distant relatives, Floyd McKee, has bricks from the fireplace in that house. Here is a painting of that house. This painting was done just before it was destroyed. It's the only one, and I have it. I told you I searched newspapers, and I was looking for comments that people made about what they saw when they traveled through this region. Here was George William Bonnell in 1840. Here's a source, by the way. And he said, the town of Seguin is pleasantly situated on the eastern bank of the Guadalupe River, 22 miles above the town of Gonzales. It's a new place, having been settled in the fall of 1838. It is improving rapidly, and the country around it will all probability soon become densely settled. It is the highest settlement up on the Guadalupe River. It was the last settlement between here, as I said, between here and San Antonio. There are several quotes in the book about what other people said about Seguin in the 1840s and 1850s in the book. Now, in the 1840s, this is the frontier of Texas, more or less. And Seguin was a point of that frontier in the 1840s. And the area was characterized. What is unique about this, I maintain, it's the only unique place in the world where several cultures intersected. You had several different tribes of American Indians. The Anglos came. The Spanish came first. Then the Republic of Mexico took over. There were people born here in Texas of Spanish descent. They're called Tejanos. They are different than immigrants from Mexico who came here. They had a different mentality. The Germans came. The French came. The Anglos came. And African Americans. All of this is a unique intersection of many different cultures right here in this small area of Texas. But anyway, the time of that was characterized by a variety of Indian raids, and Anglos raiding Indians, by the way. One of the most famous ones was Cordova Raid, and they came south of the Guadalupe River and captured a group of men who were residents of this town. They had a fight on the east of Geronimo Creek with the local Texans. The Comanche raid of 1840, if you're not familiar, the Comanches came off the Balcones Escarpment and went all the way down to Victoria. They looted stores and ships. They were riding back in a cavalcade. They had ribbons and all kinds of colorful dresses that they had stolen. It must have been a colorful series of people riding horses in that valley. Minutemen went on patrol in the 1840s and 1841. This was led by James Hughes Callahan. We had the Vasquez raids and the Wall raids in 1842, and we had the German settlements in 1845, and then annexation of the United States occurred in 1846, all in this short period of time. I said that there were Tejanos in this area. There's documentation of that. Now I'm just talking specifically about what is the confines now of Guadalupe County. But in the mid-50s, you had the Navarro, Cardenas, Flores, and families. There were two Navarro brothers. They owned approximately 20,000 acres. The Navarro family was concentrated, as you may well know, up around Geronimo. The Flores family was immediately across where the road crosses the Guadalupe River on the left-hand side. That area was the Flores Hacienda. You find Hispanic names in the tax rolls. In 1841, there was a petition to form a county. 23% of the signatures were Hispanic names. 1846, a member of the Prince Psalms continued. Now, Prince Psalms is the German group that came here, and they were passed through. They spent some time here in Seguin. They're on the way to found New Braunfels. He said that Spanish was spoken as often as English. I've read every page of the minutes of the district court minutes of Caldwell, Guadalupe, Gonzales, and Comal County. It was impressive to me the infrequency of Hispanic names that were indicted. I'm not sure why that's the case, but it's a documented fact. And at least I'm going to talk briefly about a cattle drive that left Seguin in late April of 1854 and went with 1,100 head of cattle and all the way to Warner's Ranch in California. 1854. Can you imagine driving those cattle there in 1854? It was Michael Erskine's cattle herd. I'll speak a little bit more about it later, but there are at least 6 Tejanos out of 50 drovers who joined that cattle drive to California. I told you earlier about James Hughes Callahan was in charge of the Gonzales militiamen in 1840 and 41. When Sam Houston's term was over, Lamar took over as president. He campaigned that there was too much money being spent on the Texas Army, and he basically disbanded it. What he decided to do was give authority to the counties to formulate militiamen, and whose job was to patrol and protect the frontier. James Hughes Callahan was the captain of the Gonzales militiamen that was based here in Seguin. I've traced every one of the men who were members of that, of the Gonzales militiamen under Callahan, when they were, what their terms were. He sent records to the Texas Republic of Texas. It's extensively documented, the only one that's documented in detail at that time. It ended up costing $12,000, which is a lot of money at that time. But anyway, he discusses all the raids that they took. One of them is unique. They started down here, and they went all the way up to Big Spring and back. This is discussed, by the way, in this book right here. Now you hear my horn. But there were other expeditions that they took. The one I want to particularly talk about is this one right here. They left Seguin and they went up and they went to the Llano River. They had a fight with the Comanches in the Llano River. There is a Johnson Creek which intersects with the Llano River just about 3 miles east of Junction. It's easy to find this place. I've been there several times. After the fight was over with, Callahan walked around. He and another man walked around and looked at the land. They said, aha, this is good land. It's river bottom land. There was not much river bottom land still available in Texas at that time. And he went back and had another patrol with his rangers and arranged for a surveyor to go, and they surveyed blocks of land at that time. And over a period of years, he owned about 8,000 acres in this region, and it was all based upon him finding land in one of his patrols. Now, there were people complaining that Texas Rangers went on these patrols not to defend the frontier, but to find land and to survey it, and indeed they did. Callahan is an example. Now, I want to talk about some demographics. I'm a scientist. Numbers excite me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some demographics of this region. When I wrote this narrative, my objective was that everything that the Callahan and Day family did, I was going to report on it and in the book. Every piece of land that they bought, every time they hauled into court with a juror or as a defendant or whatever, all of that I wanted to be documented in a book. I wanted to be there for posterity. I ended up with a manuscript that was and the second thing I wanted is that the published book would to meet academic historian standards. The third thing is I wanted to be published by an academic press. These are the two highest levels of acceptance of a history book that you can have. And that was my objective. I ended up with 1,000 pages. And I was real proud of myself. I had hired editors to make sure that I'm not a good writer, that it turned into a readable manuscript. And I also asked historians to read chapters and critique the chapters. One of the historians was the editor of the University of Oklahoma Press. And he said, when you're ready to publish, give us the first chance to look at it. I did. I sent it to him. I was real proud of it. And he assigned it to a man, one of the assistant editors, and he calls me up and he said, it's got 950,000 words, it's too long. And I said, well, you haven't, and I can't publish it. I said, you haven't read it. He said, it's too many words. You've got to reduce it. Ideally, books are about 250,000 words. So that was a bit of a conundrum for me. But anyway, I went to, he put me in touch with a historian at the University of Texas, and I worked through the process, and I did. I reduced it down to 502,000 words. It ended up being almost 650 published pages. There was a lot of negotiation back and forth with me and the editor to get to that point. What I want to illustrate is a lot of the information that I wrote did not end up in the final book, published book. The longest chapter was my draft number 6. It contains all of the information that was published as well as what was not published. It is on the flash drive that I have left here with the library because it's a source for most of the stuff that was cut out. When I'd run across somebody, I would write a bio of that person. I thought that was important. It was usually in the endnotes or elsewise, but that was the first thing that I cut out. And there were other things that I cut out, but and this table is not found. I don't think all the next 3 tables are not found in the book, but they are on that flash drive. But I think it's unique to talk about some of the demographics here in this area. And we're talking about Gonzales County, Guadalupe County, and Caldwell County. As you well know, up until about until Caldwell County was founded, I think in when was it, 1846? I'm not sure exactly, but all of this was Gonzales County. And by the way, on that flash drive is all the district court minutes of Gonzales and Guadalupe County and a bunch of other stuff that I collected in both those counties. But what was interesting to me is that, and I used tax rolls, and then I used the census, also the U.S. Census for 1850. In general, the counties were not too different in total population. But they sure were different in the number of slaves. Gonzales County was primarily a cotton plantation business. The other 2 counties were ranching some cotton. Now, this is even more enlightening, I think. This is from, in the 1850 census, there was an agricultural census, there was a manufacturing census, and all kinds of other information. And people then were willing to talk about their lives in the census, unlike today. And this information is extremely valuable. And as you can see, the first thing that stands out, the number of foreign people in Caldwell, Gonzales, and Guadalupe County. Who do you think these foreign people were in Guadalupe County? Germans. This is a German. There are a lot of German people that settled here. It was on the way to New Braunfels, and many of them decided this was the Mecca, and they stopped here. And if you look at the total number of acres, it's not, there's more improved acres. Well, you can see the improved acres, the number of farms in Caldwell and Gonzales County. I think the thing that was important to me is, or unique to me, is there are many more horses in Gonzales County than there were in Caldwell or Guadalupe. They were needed to pull wagons and plows. Cattle were more common in Gonzales. Look at the sheep. 2,100 sheep in Guadalupe and quite a few less in Caldwell and Gonzales County. Why do you think so? Well, Germans. Okay. Look at the hogs. Big difference in the number of hogs. Why do you think so? Hog meat was the primary diet of African American slaves. The same thing for, I want to go down here, the same thing for corn. You look at, they grew almost no, I guess they didn't eat bread in Gonzales County, but look at the amount of wheat, very little. Oats, corn, potatoes, and butter. This is interesting. Only Guadalupe County did they raise tobacco. Again, in the German influence. And it was the only place that had large amounts of wool that were produced. And as you can see, the amount of cotton grown in Caldwell and Guadalupe County is much less than that in Gonzales, again emphasizing that those two counties was a plantation mentality, and Caldwell and Guadalupe County were more of a ranching county. One of the other things that you can total is looking at the growth in wealth of personal property. And it is interesting to note that if you total these three together, it's almost $3 million in 1853. I don't know what that would be in today's money, but these were not impoverished counties. And it's not, there have been other studies of other counties, and these are not out of line with the wealth in other counties. As I said, this is not published in the book, but it is in one of the records that I left on the flash drive. I read all the district court minutes. I told you about this, the Callahan and Johnson Day family. Some of them were arrested, and so that got me interested in looking at the indictments of all kinds of in the counties. Now, I will admit these are not the same time periods, but I think still we can make some judgments about what people were being indicted for in these three counties. The first thing I'll point out, the only place where people were indicted for murder was in Gonzales County. There were no murders at this time in Caldwell and Guadalupe County. It's sort of astounding, isn't it? I think we would have thought that the wild frontier and there was a lot of killing going on. Well, if at least it wasn't murder, at least. But look at the gambling. Yeah. Most of these occurred in a concentrated time period. my and I didn't put it on the others, but it's the same thing. Okay, in other words, they might have 25 indictments in this session of the court for gambling. And I concluded that the peace officers that gambling was just, they were opposed to it, and they went on a crusade to arrest people for gambling, or all of a sudden there was a lot of gambling. But anyway, that's what it illustrates. This one is broken down a little more in the published manuscript, but I want you to look at the number. They sure did gamble a lot in Guadalupe County, or they got arrested a lot, one or the other. And James Milford Day, one of the men in this family, was one of the guys. He was frequently arrested. What else? You would have thought there was a lot of, I've always thought that the frontier, everybody was stealing horses and cattle. If you go by indictments, that's not the case. It was astounding to me. Where is that on the other one? I don't see it. But, boy, people took out their anger on each other in assault and battery. Everybody was arrested for assault and battery. Most of the fines they paid was $1, unless they wanted to make an example of you, and then they fined you $1,000. That happened a couple of times. It was a man that they didn't want in the area, and that was their way of driving them off, I guess. But anyway, this is, to me, was a fascinating table about what took place and in terms of indictments of the people of these three counties in this time frame. This is discussed more in the narrative. Now, let me stop here in just a little bit. I have some books up here. This book here is a Seth Eastman sketchbook. The originals are in the McNay Institute in San Antonio. This is published by the McNay. Seth Eastman was a lieutenant in the Engineer Corps of the United States Army, and he sketched everywhere. He later did, when he got on the frontier in a later period of time with American Indians, he made a lot of paintings. He came through Seguin, and he left sketches of Seguin of what it looked like in 1845 when the U.S. Army came through. I'll tell you back, 1848. This might be a little difficult to see, but this book, I brought this book and I've donated it to the library because I wanted it to be available for people in this area. But if I'm on River Street and I'm driving north and I cross the river, it goes up and it makes a curve to the right and then it goes to the left. Here's that curve and here's where it straightens out and goes right up River Street. That's where his perspective. James Hughes Callahan's house was right over here just outside of the view. But this is what, it's log cabins. In 1848, this is what the city looked like. Here is another drawing. This is a cabin, a dog trot cabin. He says it's in Seguin, Live Oaks in Seguin. Yep, it's probably just outside of Seguin. It could be inside. Seguin, it's not real specific. But it again illustrates that these were log cabins in this area in 1848. In I think it's 52, Jacob de Cordova. Have you ever heard of this man's name, Jacob de Cordova? He's important to the history of this part of the world. If you drive down the road from here to New Braunfels, he bought a lot of that land on the east and the west side of the Guadalupe River. I mean, he bought about 10,000, 15,000 acres. And what he was going to do is subdivide it. It was a development project, typical Texan land development. He did subdivide it. He started out trying to sell 500 acres at a time, then reduced it to 250. He's finally down to selling it at 50. This is Jacob de Cordova. There is a road, the Cordova Road. That's where this is named after him, Jacob de Cordova. Anyway, at the same time he was doing his project, a lady, her name was Sarah Ann Lilly Hardinge. She and her husband came to Texas. And they lived in this they lived part-time in Austin and lived part-time here in Seguin on the property that de Cordova was building, was subdividing and developing. And she made paintings. These are published in these books here, The Views of Texas. I think you all have 3 copies. Have 2, they're copies here in the library. They're fascinating examples of the lifestyle of people. Now, this is approximately 5 years after Eastman came through. It is not a log cabin. This is the Morrison House. Actually, this house was built by William Early Jones. And if you drive down Highway 90, where it crosses the Guadalupe River on the other side is where Jones owned his land and where he first built this house. He sold it to Mr. Morrison in 1850. I'll tell you a little bit more about William Early Jones. But look at this. Isn't it remarkable? White picket fences, well manicured, beautiful. Is that a 3-story clapboard house? Here is another one. Now this is the river crossing where the river road now crosses the Guadalupe. Isn't that remarkable? You need to check out one of these books and pay attention to the detail. Quite colorful. This is the north side of Seguin. This is the downtown. If you can barely see, this is the courthouse, one of the first 2-story courthouse that was built. And look at this. They're all in fancy buckboards. This is macadamianized roads, by the way. Picket fences, clapboard houses, all painted white, some red, but a drastic difference in lifestyle that she painted than what Eastman did. These 2 books are here for people to examine about how people lived, particularly their dwellings, in Seguin in the 1840s and the 1850s. Her paintings are in the Amon G. Carter Museum in Fort Worth. And these books are published by the Amon G. Carter Museum. Now, I'm going to sort of change the subject, and I wrote about one chapter. It's one of the longest chapters in the book, but I'm talking about what it was like to live in Seguin at the time of the 1850s. And one of the things that people were insistent upon is that their children were going to receive a good education. And they created the Guadalupe House School here in Seguin. It was it had a superintendent, and his name was William J. Glass. His wife taught also. There was another lady who taught. One of the other families here was the Tom family, and William Tom gave a commencement speech on June the 24th at the Seguin High School. This is Guadalupe High School, it should say. It's published in the Texas Advocate, and he said, "Who would believe 20 years ago that this secluded spot on the Guadalupe River would in so short a period have become the field of civilization?" He continued to say, "It may be said by the next generation that education on a firm fundamental basis in West Texas had its inception in this building. Here, American, Castilian, and German, the rich, the poor, the orphan, can acquire that power. This was the attitude, I think this reflects the attitude that people had at that time about public education and the importance of education. And notice he said, American, Castilian, and German. Americans, Hispanics, and German. The first class in 1850 had 110 male and female students, and the next session had 115. That's a lot of kids being educated here in Seguin. So education was important in this part of the world. This is on the inside, the fly page of the Sarah Hembriday Day prayer book. She started writing this prayer book in September of 1842. She wrote almost every Sunday, not every Sunday, in her prayer book. And she died in, I think, in 1858, more or less. But anyway, she recorded her thoughts. They were usually, the first sentence were religious thoughts. But she also made comments about health and a variety of other things in the prayer book, prayer journal. And you can see some idea about how people felt in their religion in the first sentence. November 1844, 4 days of shouting in Seguin. They had a camp meeting. I feel that the Lord is with us. I do seek the Christian fellowship in the Methodist Church, and 6 of my children join the church. The church religion appears to flourish, and the Christians are encouraged to attend Sunday school. All is in harmony. 1 year later, she said, it appears that there is got up a prejudice in the Methodist Church against me, and they do turn me out of their fellowship. Now, she got back in a few months later, but then she went back to her original faith in the Baptist Church in 1845. Now, the first organized Methodist Church was built here occurred here in 1839, and the First Baptist Church came in 1851. This is more extensively explored in the book about how churches came to this part of Texas, specifically in Seguin and the Guadalupe River Basin. Health was important. Well, we all have health problems. They had more than we had at that particular time. And this comes from the diary of Eliza Tips Wupperman. In May on May the 31st, 1852, in Seguin, several people died of cholera. Among them were 2 tailors, Kessler and Winthrop. By the way, they had the Kessler and Winthrop probate, and nobody would buy their stuff. They were afraid of the contagion. She talks about how their family experienced, and I was interested, how often did people get sick? And in her family, they had sickness about 12 times, once a month, every year, fever, dysentery, colds, headaches, chills, and toothaches. And during this years, two of her children died. In 1845, Herman Seeley, he was one of the early settlers in New Braunfels. He was sick in 1845 on 12 different occasions. From 1842 to 1853, this is from the Sarah Hembriday Day prayer book, on 27 occasions she wrote of sickness. Sickness was quite common, unfortunately, during this time. And there weren't many doctors around. Some of them were quacks. Some of them had been educated in medical school. If I wanted to be a doctor at that time, I could hang a shingle out, call myself a doctor, and start being a doctor. One of the members of this family, Solomon Brill, was educated as a doctor in New York, and he was in New Orleans at the time of the Texas Revolution, and he joined some Texan people coming to fight here. He did not practice medicine here in this town. In Seguin, they had Dr. Caleb S. Brown and Dr. John E. Park. In Prairie Lea, it's the other place that I write about, they had James Fentress and Dr. David E. Brown. In other words, there were doctors around. I'm not sure about the quality of these doctors. In 1852, Seguin had one new drugstore, none in Prairie Lea. All of the medicines were patented. They were ineffective. They did know about laudanum and had quinine for malaria, but that's the only kind of medications that were effective medications. Poor folks, they did not have the kind of health opportunities that we did. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about William Early Jones. I added this slide later. He's a distinguished looking guy, isn't he? He's more extensively explored in the book than what I'm going to summarize here, but he and his family came to Texas in 1840, and they settled along where the Comanches raided, and they decided that was too hostile, and they moved to this area. He's the man that built the Morrison House on the other side of the Guadalupe River. He was the elected. He was a lawyer. He came from Georgia, founded several newspapers in Georgia. He was quite a dynamic person, but anyway, he was a representative from Seguin in the House of Representatives in the Republic of Texas. He was also a district judge, and his judgeship went all the way from Victoria up to, at later times, and it covered Williamson County and Travis County and and Bexar County. At that time, if you were in the Republic of Texas, if you were a district judge, you were also an associate judge of the Supreme Court. He wrote several opinions on the Supreme Court. So he's really sort of an interesting gentleman that has not been really well written about. Some young, enterprising graduate student of history, of Texas history, this is a great opportunity to talk about a man, and there's a lot of material about him. He's a very complex person, but he was, now I'm going to briefly summarize some other elements in the book, and then we'll call my lecture to a close here. But I talk a bit about James Hughes Callahan's childhood in Georgia. He came to Texas with the Georgia Battalion. A lot of men came to fight in the Texas Revolution. One was a Georgia Battalion, and he came with it. They landed in Velasco just before Christmas of 1835. Stephen F. Austin welcomed them. They were there, and then they were sent by Fannin to Refugio, and then they moved to Goliad, and that's where Fannin was collecting his troops together. When the Mexican army was invading that side of Texas, Fannin sent the Georgia Battalion to Refugio to collect some women and others that were left there and bring them back to Goliad, and they got trapped there by the Mexican army. They had a fight. They escaped and wandered in the swamplands up to Victoria. While they were wandering is when the Battle of Coleto occurred, and all those Texans were captured by the Mexican army. Eventually, the Georgia Battalion was captured. With the Mexican army was a German officer. He was in the Mexican army, but he was trained in Germany. He knew that Santa Anna was going to kill these men, and he did everything he could to save them, and he asked for people who were carpenters, and Callahan raised his hand, and 16 men were set aside in Victoria. They were there to repair boats and build a bridge. They were not sent to Goliad, and that's how he missed the massacre in Goliad. Sarah Hembree Day had a very interesting childhood. I told you her father was a Hardshell Baptist preacher. He actually, up until 50 years old, he was a hellraiser. Then he saw Christ came into his life, and he became a radical evangelic preacher. He disowned, by the way, Sarah Hembree Day. But anyway, they came to Texas. Her husband, Johnson Day, was an alcoholic. He was kicked out of, there are minutes on this, he was kicked out of the Baptist churches for drinking too much. That's how they try to discipline people. But anyway, he died. I talk about divorces in Gonzales County. And if I were to ask you, did people get divorces in the 1840s in Texas? What would you say? It was not uncommon. There were 8 in Gonzales County. This was not well populated at the time. This is up to 1840 through 1843. 6 were filed by women and 2 by men. I explore these divorces because one of them was Sarah Medissa Day. Her first husband was William Wirt Alsbury. He married her in the spring of 1838 and abandoned her when she got sick with a dysentery at the same time of her father in the summer of 1838. He wandered around, and Callahan shows up in Seguin in the fall of 1840, and they fall in love, and they start living together in that house just off of River Street. She couldn't divorce William Wirt unless 3 years passed. As soon as 3 years passed, she filed for a divorce in a district court. And that was in March of 1842. Vasquez invaded Texas. The district court was canceled. So the next district court was the fall of 1842. Wall invades and the district court is canceled. In fact, her lawyer was captured and hauled off to Mexico. And so was the district judge. Now she's pregnant. She's in a quandary. And she appeals to the, another way you could get a divorce in the Republic of Texas, you could go and ask the Senate and the House to give you a divorce. And so she appeals, and they approve it in the House. One man objected in the Senate, and they disbanded that session. So she's left again married to this guy that she wants to divorce. And finally, in March of 1843, she gets her divorce in the district court and marries Callahan. This is not uncommon. The story I told you, I can tell you of 3 occasions in my family here. Same sort of thing. It was not uncommon. Now, I told you about the cattle drive. Michael Erskine had owned 20,000 acres on the south side of the Guadalupe River, about halfway between here and Gonzales, and he pulled together 1,100 head of cattle. He hired Callahan to be the ramrod, paid him $1,500, $1 per mile to lead the cattle herd to California, and Callahan did. Erskine kept a diary every day of what they did. This diary has been published twice. I explored how many cattle herds left Texas at this time. I found 25. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about as many as 15 to 20,000 cattle left this area to go to California. Why did they take cattle there? You could buy them for $10 a head here and sell them for $150 a head in California. There was no cattle available for those gold miners. So Erskine drove his cattle out there, and Callahan led the way. When they got out there, there were 880 head left. Half of the ones that disappeared, they ate. It was one of the most successful cattle drives in California. Erskine, he squandered his cattle, bought a potato crop. It was in the ground. The rust killed it. Wheat, he bought some wheat, rust killed it. He ended up impoverished, by the way, coming back to Texas. Callahan and some William Early Jones and 3 other men decided to form the Pittsburgh Land Company. Historians have never written about this. They bought a league of land on the Blanco River, right where it's in the center of it today is Blanco City, and they were going to develop it. And Indian raids were scaring off prospective customers, according to William Early Jones. He wrote letters to editors. He wrote to the governor. And on July the 3rd, they bought the land at an auction. It's a complicated land transaction, interesting read, but they bought the land on July the 3rd and July the 5th. William Early Jones is in the office of Governor Pease and said, we need a ranger company to fend off the Indian raids. Otherwise, people are going to abandon the frontier. And Pease says, James Hughes Callahan formed the ranger company and chased the Indians away. He chased them into Mexico, had a fight with the Mexican auxiliary. It was a draw. He withdrew back to Piedras Negras, and in the process, this town was burned down. As you can imagine, this caused an international incident. In fact, he was threatened for being indicted. But it's 7 chapters on the Callahan expedition. Never been explored to the depth that I have explored it. Callahan was killed in the blasting game, an affair on his property on the Blanco River on April 7, 1856. Historians have never explored this episode of feuds between family. I have explored it extensively, and briefly there were the 23 guards that were guarding the Blasting Game were arrested the next day after killing Callahan and another man, and they were held in a jail in a place called Middleton. It doesn't exist today. It's on the Little Blanco River. They were guarded by guards, and they were, somebody came in and hauled them out of the house and shot them. And 23 men were indicted. They were the guards. Next year, 3 of Callahan's brother-in-laws were indicted. I've traced all of these episodes in the court. Nobody was ever convicted. They were all finally either found not guilty or dismissed. It's a fascinating read. I've looked at Callahan's probate, and if you want to understand about some of the dynamics, I know who these people are. I have talked with them a long time, and I used a lot of the information they gave me. Okay? I've tried to be sensitive to them about the circumstances. I never could figure out what was the argument between Blasting Game and Callahan. Everybody has all kinds of theories. I don't know. I never could figure out who really killed the Blasting Game. Certainly the Blasting Games killed Callahan and Baldhead Johnson. I never could figure out who killed the Blasting Games. I'm not certain of that. And it's the biggest disagreement I had with my editor. He said, "Oh, you've got to take a position on it." I said, no, I don't have data. I can't prove it. So I didn't. But you want to read about the Blasting Game Callahan affair, buy the book, please, or check it out of the library. I talk about the Callahan probate. Probates are fascinating. And if you want to know something about the nature of probates in Texas, this is a very good example. I do follow the fate of the day of all of these members of the Day family I showed you in the first slide, what happens to them. I do follow the Callahan children. One of those is my great-great-grandfather, James Sanford Callahan, but I follow them. And it's interesting to see, I did the same thing, and this did not get published, followed all the children of all of these 7 families. And it's interesting to see how after about 4th generations, families disintegrated. They lost contact with each other. And I don't know about people who studied families whether this is a common phenomenon or not, but it's certainly, and in fact, some of them ended up suing each other on land here in Guadalupe County. But let me ask any questions that you have. Erskine, Michael Erskine. Michael Erskine. It was the Baum Ranch.
Didn't they Navarro and them own a bunch of land, and the state of Texas declared no Spanish land grants?
Well, the Navarro brothers and Flores and Cardenas together, they all own about 20,000 acres. I think Navarro probably owned about half of that.
Take it away from him.
Huh? No, he sold it. When Navarro got older, he sold his ranch. They all sold their ranches. Old man Cardenas died, and he sold it. Flores sold it. They all sold it about the same time, about 1855, more or less. But they sold it. I don't think he had land here. I never explored in this book about how, the interaction between Seguin and the town of Seguin and the town of Seguin. So I don't really know the answer to that, whether he did or did not. No, I don't think that's true. Now, there were a lot of court cases about that, but in general, one of the things that I learned is that common law here in this Texas comes from English. Land law comes from the Spanish. And all of the land was distributed by Spanish law. When the Republic of Texas was founded, they wanted common law, but they said, all the land has been distributed by Spanish law. So they kept Spanish law for the land, but used common law for everything else. It's very difficult. It was difficult to take land away from people. The way that it occurred along the Rio Grande border is that the Anglo men married into the families. And that's been discussed by other historians. It's beyond my scope. But I don't think they didn't take land away from people. Well, I want to take, now we're talking about the Rangers and the Hispanic people. Generally, those kind of interactions occurred after the Civil War. Up until particularly 1855, it was very common when the Rangers went out on patrol that there were a lot of Tejanos on those, with the Ranger groups. This is all documented. And I didn't go into this, but the other incident in Seguin is well known as the Cart War of 1848. And there were a lot of ethnic prejudice beginning to be expressed at that time because of a lot of the tension that is occurring in the United States about the abolition of slavery and between the North and the South. But the tension between from what I understand, and the Rangers and the Hispanic people primarily occurred after the Civil War. But I appreciate your time, and I hope that you will take the initiative to read the book, whether you buy it or check it out. You'll learn a lot about the history of this particular area prior to the Civil War. But I will end this to say that I've tried to emphasize that Seguin was a frontier town, and by the Civil War, it was a bustling, sophisticated town. So let me stop there, and thank you very much.